I came home from Afghanistan in a medical transport with one leg and a flag they almost gave my mother instead of me. And the first thing my brother said when he saw me at the airport was, "Well, at least you still have the good one." He said it in front of my father, my mother, and 12 other people who had come to welcome me home. And my father laughed, and that laugh told me everything I needed to understand about what the next 3 years of my life were going to cost me, and exactly what I was going to have to build in silence before anyone in that family understood what they had miscalculated. What I had carried home from Afghanistan was not just a purple heart and a prosthetic. I had carried home something none of them knew existed yet. And the day they found out is the reason I am telling this story. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. I want to take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is not the airport, and it is not the laugh, and it is not the 12 people standing in the arrivals terminal at Charlotte Douglas with a welcome home banner that my mother had made herself with a Cricut machine and green ribbon. The beginning is a Tuesday evening in September 2009 when I was 17 years old and sitting at the dinner table in the house I grew up in, a 3-bedroom ranch house in Concord, North Carolina, with brown carpet in the hallways and a kitchen that always smelled like whatever my mother had been cooking since 4 in the afternoon. And my father put down his fork and looked at my brother Derek across the table and said, "Son, I want to talk to you about the business." And what followed was a 40-minute conversation about the future of Callaway Property Services, the landscaping and grounds maintenance company my father had built over 22 years from a single mower and a pickup truck to a 12-employee operation with commercial contracts across Cabarrus County, a conversation about succession and expansion and what it would look like when Derek eventually took over, a conversation conducted entirely as though I was not sitting at the same table eating the same pot roast, which I was, and which I had been doing every Tuesday evening for 17 years. And the invisibility of it was so complete and so practiced that I understood it was not an oversight. It was an architecture, the deliberate construction of a family narrative in which Derek was the future and I was the furniture. My name is James Callaway. I am 34 years old. I served 8 years in the United States Army, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, and I came home from the second one missing my left leg below the knee and carrying a clarity about human character that you can only develop by being in situations where character is the only variable that determines whether people live or die. And what that clarity eventually showed me about my own family is the reason I am telling this story in this specific order with this specific level of detail, rather than the abbreviated version I told people for years when they asked, which was that my family and I had some differences and had gone our separate ways, which was the most significant understatement of my adult life. Derek is 4 years older than me, and the dynamic between us was established so early and so thoroughly that by the time I was old enough to name it, I had already been living inside it for a decade and had absorbed it as the natural order rather than a choice someone had made. Derek was the one my father coached in Little League, even though I was the one who could actually hit. Derek was the one my father drove to college visits in the fall of his senior year, even though I had a higher GPA and more extracurriculars and had asked to visit 3 schools that I paid for myself with money from my after-school job at the hardware store. Derek was the one my father introduced at Chamber of Commerce events and church dinners and neighborhood gatherings as my son who was going to take over the business someday. And I was the one standing beside Derek at those events being introduced as, "And this is James," which is a sentence that ends so quickly and with so little information that the person receiving it has no choice but to treat the subject of it as a subordinate detail in someone else's story. I enlisted in the Army in January 2010, for months after that Tuesday dinner, and I want to be honest about the mixture of reasons, because honesty about the mixture is more useful than a single clean narrative. Part of it was genuine, the specific pull towards service that some people feel, and that I had felt since I was old enough to understand what service meant, And part of it was the pragmatic recognition that the military would fund an education that my family had made clear they were not going to fund the way they had funded Derek's. And part of it was the understanding that I was not going to build anything in Concord, North Carolina, while standing in the shadow of a brother who had been designated the future before either of us was old enough to vote. I told my parents at dinner on a Sunday evening. My mother cried. My father said, "That is a good option for someone who does not have a clear direction," which was the most efficient dismissal I had ever received from him, and which I filed away with the Chamber of Commerce introductions and the Tuesday dinner and every other piece of documentation I had been unconsciously accumulating since I was old enough to understand that documentation was the only thing that stood between your version of events and someone else's. I want to stop here for a moment because I know this story is reaching people in a lot of different places. And I mean it every time I say I want to know where you are watching from. Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments right now. I read them all, and this community is something specific, and I want to know who is in this room with me. I did 2 deployments. The first was in 2012, Kandahar province, 11 months, and I came home to a family that had continued its life with the specific undisturbed continuity of people who had not been waiting in the way that families wait when they understand that someone they love is somewhere dangerous. My mother sent care packages and called every Sunday, which I want to credit because it was real and it mattered, but my father mentioned my deployment at a Chamber of Commerce dinner as an example of how the family was giving back to the country, which is a sentence that uses a person's sacrifice as a decorative detail in the speaker's public image, and that I absorbed without comment because I had been absorbing versions of that sentence my whole life. Derek had expanded the business while I was gone, added 3 new commercial accounts, hired 2 more employees, and my father talked about it at that same dinner with the specific pride he reserved for Derek's accomplishments, which was warm and detailed and completely unlike the way he talked about my deployment. And I sat at that dinner and ate my chicken and drank my water and noted the comparison the way I noted everything, quietly, precisely, without attaching a conclusion to it before. The evidence warranted one. The second deployment was in 2015, Helmand province, and on the 43rd day a pressure plate IED detonated beneath the left rear wheel of the vehicle I was riding in, and I woke up in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany with my left leg gone below the knee and a traumatic brain injury that took 8 months of rehabilitation to work through, and that left me with chronic headaches and a sensitivity to loud noise that I still manage every day. I want to tell you about the calls I received from my family while I was at Landstuhl and then at Walter Reed, because the calls are part of the record and the record is the story. My mother called every day for the first 2 weeks and then every other day and then twice a week. And I want to be clear that her consistency in those calls was one of the things that kept me oriented during a period when orientation was genuinely difficult. My father called 4 times in 14 months. I know because I kept a log, the same way I kept logs of everything by then. Not out of grievance, but out of the habit of a person who had learned that the record of what happened is more reliable than anyone's memory of it, including your own. The first call was when I was still in Germany, and he said, "Son, we are praying for you," which lasted 6 minutes. The second was 3 months into Walter Reed, and he said, "Your mother tells me the therapy is going well," which lasted 4 minutes. The third was 7 months in, and he said, "Derek is thinking about opening a second location. I thought you would want to know," which told me everything about where his attention was and lasted 3 minutes. The fourth call was 2 days before I was discharged from Walter Reed, and he said, "We will see you at the airport," which lasted 90 seconds and contained no question about how I was feeling or what I needed or what the previous 14 months had actually been like for the person who had lived them. The airport was on a Thursday in March 2017, and the welcome home banner was green and white, and my mother had spelled out James Marcus Calloway in full, which was the name she used when she wanted me to know she meant it. And there were 12 people there, including my father and Derek's wife, Pam, and 3 of my father's friends from the Chamber of Commerce. And I walked through the arrivals door on my prosthetic leg and my crutch and my dress uniform, and I watched their faces do the thing that faces do when they see something they were not fully prepared for despite having been told, the specific recalibration of a person adjusting the image they had been carrying to match the reality in front of them. And my father hugged me and said, "Welcome home, son." And Derek stood behind him and looked at my leg and said, "Well, at least you still have the good one." And 12 people heard it, and my father laughed. And I stood in that arrivals terminal in my dress uniform with my Purple Heart and my prosthetic and my 14 months of Walter Reed, and I smiled. The specific controlled smile of a person who has just received the final piece of information they needed and who knows exactly what they're going to do with it. And what I had carried home from Afghanistan that none of them knew existed, yet was already in motion. And what it was going to cost Derek and my father when it finally surfaced is the reason I kept every call log, every document, every record, every piece of paper that had my name on it from the moment I enlisted in January 2010. And the moment it surfaced was closer than any of them understood. The 3 years between the airport and the moment everything changed were the years that built the architecture of what was coming. And I want to walk you through them with the precision they deserve, because the details are not background, they are the foundation. And the foundation is what made the outcome inevitable rather than lucky. And I have never been interested in luck as a strategy, because luck is what you rely on when you have not done the work. And I had done the work methodically, quietly, in the specific way of a person who has learned that the most powerful position in any situation is the one where the other party does not know you are preparing. When I left Walter Reed in March 2017, I had 3 things that the people at that airport did not know about, and that I had been building during the months of rehabilitation when the work of recovery gave me more cognitive time than most people understood. Because rehabilitation is physical in the mornings and mental in the afternoons, and in the evenings when the ward gets quiet and the other patients are sleeping and you are lying in a hospital bed with a laptop and a legal pad and the specific focused energy of someone who has decided that the circumstances of their return are going to be different from the circumstances of their departure. The first thing I had was a degree, a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration that I had completed through the Army's distance learning program, over 7 years of deployments and training cycles and hospital stays, finishing the last 12 credits during my 14 months at Walter Reed, because the occupational therapist encouraged cognitive engagement, and I had decided that the most useful cognitive engagement available to me was finishing something I had started in 2010 partly to prove to a man in Concord, North Carolina, that a good option for someone who does not have a clear direction could produce credentials he had never thought to question. The second thing I had was a financial position that no one in my family knew the shape of. Because 8 years of military service with 2 combat deployments and a tax-free combat zone status and a disability rating that produced a monthly compensation that I had been depositing into an account I had opened independently in 2011 had accumulated into a number that I was not going to describe to anyone in that arrivals terminal or at any dinner table in Concord until I understood exactly what I needed it to do. The third thing I had was a document, a single document that I had requested from the Veterans Benefits Administration in January 2017, while I was still at Walter Reed, and that had arrived in a manila envelope that I had opened alone in my room and read 3 times before I put it back in the envelope and placed it in the folder I kept in the front compartment of my bag, the folder I had been adding to since 2010. And that document is the one I am not going to describe fully yet, because its description belongs in the moment it was used rather than in the setup. But I want you to understand that it existed and that it had been in my possession for 2 months before I walked through that arrivals door, and that its existence was the reason I was able to smile the controlled smile rather than the broken one when my brother made his joke in front of 12 people. I moved back to Concord because I needed to understand the terrain before I could decide what to do with what I was holding. And understanding terrain is something the Army teaches you in ways that transfer beyond geography. It is the practice of moving through an environment long enough to know which ground is solid and which ground will shift under pressure and where the exits are before you need them. I rented a small apartment on Church Street, 2 bedrooms, ground floor because the prosthetic was still calibrating and stairs were an unnecessary variable. And I furnished it with the specific minimalism of someone who has spent 8 years in situations where everything you own fits in a rucksack and has developed a relationship with objects that prioritizes function over accumulation. My mother came to see the apartment the first week and brought food and stayed for 3 hours, and we talked the way we had talked on Sundays from Germany and from Walter Reed, with the warmth of 2 people who had maintained a genuine connection across distance and circumstance. And she said, "James, I hope you know how proud I am of you." And I said, "I know, Mom." And I believed her, and I want to be clear that my mother is not the subject of this story in the way that my father and Derek are the subject of this story, because she had shown up in the ways that a mother shows up, and the ways she had not shown up were the result of a family dynamic she had been navigating for 40 years, and that had its own complicated weight that I understood without requiring her to explain it. My father came to see the apartment once, 2 weeks after I moved in, and spent 45 minutes telling me about the business, about the second location Derek had opened in Harrisburg, about the new equipment they had purchased, about a commercial contract with a property management company that covered 17 complexes across the county. And I sat in my kitchen and listened and said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments. And at the end of the 45 minutes, he said, "You should think about coming on with the company. We could use someone in the office." And I said, "I will think about it." And he said, "Nothing glamorous, just administrative, processing paperwork, that kind of thing. And I want you to understand what that offer was, because it was not a generous inclusion of a returning veteran's son into the family business. It was an administrative placement offer for a man with a business degree and 8 years of Army logistics experience and a disability rating, and a document in a folder that my father had no idea existed. And the gap between what the offer assumed about me and what was actually true about me is the gap that eventually produced everything that came after. I want to pause here because I know this story is traveling and I want to know where it is landing. Drop your city, your state, wherever you are watching from right now in the comments. I genuinely read them and I want to know who is sitting with me right now, because this next part is where the architecture starts to show itself. I did not take the administrative position. I told my father I needed more time to complete my rehabilitation and transition planning, which was true and was also the most useful framing I could offer, because it kept the door open without walking through it in the wrong direction. And I spent the following 6 months doing several things that I am going to describe in the order that I did them, because the order is what reveals the intention. I hired an attorney, a veterans benefits specialist named Carol Hutchins, who had an office in Charlotte and who had been recommended to me by a caseworker at Walter Reed, and who, when I spread my documents across her conference table in April 2017, looked at the folder and then looked at me and said, "Mr. Calloway, how long have you been keeping records like this?" And I said, "Since 2010. And she said, "All of it?" And I said, "Everything." And she said, "Good, because what you are showing me has dimensions that are going to require careful handling, and I want to make sure we understand the full picture before we move." What Carol found when she reviewed the full picture is something I am going to build toward rather than deliver here, because it connects to the document in the folder in a way that requires the surrounding context to land correctly. But I will tell you that her first call after our initial meeting was to a colleague who specialized in an area of law that I had not specifically anticipated needing, and that her second call was to a contact at the North Carolina Secretary of State's Business Registration Office, and that both calls produced information that changed the shape of everything I had been building and added a dimension I had not known existed when I put the folder together. Derek called me in September 2017, 6 months after the airport, and the call was brief and social on the surface and operational underneath, in the way that Derek's calls had always been when he wanted something without wanting to appear to want it. And he said, "Dad is talking about doing some estate planning. Nothing urgent, just getting things organized." And he mentioned that it would be good if you could come to a family meeting next month. And I said, "Sure, I can do that." And I said it with the same control comm I had used at the airport and at every dinner table and at every Chamber of Commerce event. And after I hung up, I called Carol and I told her about the family meeting. And she said, "Renee, how much of what we discussed last month do you want to have in place before that meeting?" And I said, "All of it." And she said, "Then we need to move faster than I had planned." And I said, "Tell me what you need from me." And she said, "I need you to look at something that came back from the Secretary of State's office, because James, she never called me by my first name in a professional context, except when she was about to tell me something significant. She said, 'James, what I found is not what I expected, and it changes the timeline for everything we are doing.' And the thing she found is the reason the estate planning meeting my brother called in October 2017 did not go the way anyone in my family expected it to go except for me. Carol's office was on the 14th floor of a building in uptown Charlotte, and I want to tell you about the afternoon she showed me what came back from the Secretary of State's office, because that afternoon is where the story changed from something I was carrying privately into something that was going to require a different kind of precision entirely, the kind that has legal dimensions and institutional weight and the specific irreversibility of a process that once started moves at the pace of documentation rather than the pace of feeling. I sat across from Carol at her conference table in October 2017, and she opened a folder and pushed a document toward me, and I read it the way I read everything that matters, slowly and completely, not skimming for the conclusion, but moving through every line, because the lines before the conclusion are the ones that determine whether the conclusion holds. And what I read in that document was a business registration record from the North Carolina Secretary of State's office showing the ownership structure of Callaway Property Services as it had been filed and as it had been amended over the 22 years of its existence. And the amendment that Carol had flagged in yellow highlighter was dated June 14th, 2010, 5 months after I enlisted in the Army. And it showed a restructuring of the company's ownership that had reduced the designated inheritance stake for secondary heirs and consolidated operational and succession control into a single heir designation that named Derek Callaway as the sole successor to full ownership upon the death or incapacitation of Gerald Callaway. And I want you to understand what that means in plain language, because the legal language is precise, but the plain language is what tells you what actually happened, which is that 5 months after I left for basic training, my father had amended his business registration to remove any structural claim I might have had to the company I had grown up watching him build. And he had done it quietly and without telling me and without any conversation about what it meant. And the amendment had been notarized and filed and had been sitting in the Secretary of State's records for 7 years while I deployed twice and came home once with one leg and was offered an administrative position processing paperwork. I looked up from the document and Carol was watching my face with the specific attention of an attorney who has delivered difficult information before and understands that the first 90 seconds after delivery tell you more about a client's character than most other things. And I said, "When was this filed relative to my enlistment date?" And she said, 147 days after your enlistment. And I said, "And my father would have needed to affirmatively initiate this amendment. It would not have happened automatically." And she said, "Correct. This required a deliberate filing with specific instructions." And I said, "And Derek, would he have known about this?" And she paused and said, "The notarized filing has a witness signature." And she turned to the second page and pointed, and the witness signature was Derek Allen Callaway. And I looked at that signature for a moment and I felt the cold, settling feeling of a confirmation arriving after years of suspicion, not surprise. confirmation. And I said, what else did you find? And Carol said, that is the question I want to spend the rest of this meeting on, because the amendment is one layer and there are others. And I said, show me everything. What Carol had found beneath the amendment layer was a pattern that became visible only when you looked at the company's financial filings in sequence alongside the ownership structure changes. And the pattern was this, that in the 3 years between my second deployment and my return from Walter Reed, while I was in Afghanistan, and then in Germany, and then in rehabilitation, Callaway Property Services had taken on a significant equipment loan, $240,000 in 2015, and an additional $110,000 in 2016. And both loans had been secured against the company's assets, and both had been approved with Gerald Callaway and Derek Callaway listed as the authorizing parties, which was consistent with the amended ownership structure, but which produced a specific financial consequence that I want you to understand, because it is the consequence that gives the document in my folder its particular weight. The loans had increased the company's debt load to a point where the net asset value of the business, meaning the number you would arrive at if you subtracted what was owed from what was owned, was significantly lower in 2017 than it had been in 2010 when the amendment was filed, which meant that even if a court were to find that the amendment was improper and that I had a legitimate claim to a portion of the company's value, the portion I would be claiming had been made smaller by the debt that had been accumulated during the years I was serving and therefore unable to monitor or object. And the question Carol was building toward was whether the timing of the debt accumulation relative to my deployment schedule was coincidental or whether it was something more deliberate. And the answer to that question depended on what the company's operational financials showed about whether those loans had produced the growth and equipment capacity their amount suggested they should have produced, or whether the money had moved in a direction that the balance sheet could not fully account for. I want to stop here because I know this story is in a wide room and I want to know who is in it with me right now. Drop your city, your state, wherever in the world you are watching from, in the comments below. I read everyone and I mean it, and today especially I want to know because what Carol told me next is the kind of information that changes not just a legal strategy, but the fundamental understanding of what a family has been doing while someone was not looking. Carol had retained a forensic accountant named Howard Briggs, a 62-year-old man with 30 years of experience in small business financial analysis, who had reviewed 4 years of Callaway Property Services financial statements and had produced a 12-page summary that Carol now pushed across the table to me. And I read it with the same methodical attention I had given the Secretary of State document. And what Howard Briggs had found was that the equipment listed as the purpose for both loans, specifically a fleet expansion and a facility upgrade, did not appear in the company's asset register at the values that would be consistent with the loan amounts, that the depreciation schedules for the allegedly purchased equipment showed accelerated write-downs that were inconsistent with the actual age of the physical assets, and that there were cash withdrawals from the company's operating account in 2015 and 2016, totaling approximately $87,000 that were categorized as consulting fees, but had no corresponding vendor documentation, no contracts, no invoices, number 1099 filings, which meant either the consulting fees were paid to someone operating entirely off the record or the consulting fees were not consulting fees. And Howard Briggs had noted in his summary that the withdrawal amounts and timing were consistent with personal distributions taken outside of the standard dividend structure, which in a closely held business with a disputed ownership. Structure is a category of transaction with specific legal implications that Carol spent 20 minutes explaining to me in terms that I want to distill for you as simply as I can, which is that if money was taken out of a company through a mechanism that misrepresented its nature on the financial statements, and if that money benefited parties who had restructured the ownership specifically to exclude another party from sharing in those benefits, the legal description of that situation is not just poor accounting. It is something with a name that produces consequences in a courtroom. And Carol said that name to me quietly at the end of those 20 minutes. And I said, how strong is Howard's analysis? And she said, strong enough to file. And I said, and the Secretary of State amendment. And she said, strong enough to challenge. And I said, and the document in my folder. And Carol looked at me and said, James, I have been practicing veterans benefits law for 19 years. And what is in that document, combined with what Howard found and what the Secretary of State's office produced, is not a case that I would typically see in a single file. And I said, I know. And she said, the family meeting Derek asked you to attend. What do you know about what they are planning to do at that meeting? And I said, I know that my father is talking about estate planning, and I know that Derek called the meeting, which means Derek has a reason to want me in a room before any filing happens. And Carol said, which means they may be planning to ask you to sign something. And I said, yes. And she said, Renee, if they present you with a document at that meeting, I want you to look at it, thank them for it, and tell them you will review it with your attorney. And I said, I know how to look at a document and not sign it. And she almost smiled. And then she said, there is one more thing I need to tell you about what Howard found, something that was not in the financial statements, but that he identified through a filing connected to the equipment loan application. And this one is the piece that I think changes what is possible here from a legal standpoint. And she turned to the last page of Howard's summary, and I read it. And when I finished reading it, I understood why she had saved it for the end. Because the last page contained the name of the bank officer who had processed both equipment loans and the documentation Howard had found in the public record connecting that officer to a business address that also appeared on one of the consulting fee withdrawals, which meant the money that had left Callaway Property Services as consulting fees may not have gone to an anonymous third party, but to a specific individual with a specific relationship to the loan approval process. And the implications of that connection are the reason Carol's next call after our meeting was not to a business attorney, but to a contact at the North Carolina Banking Commission. And the reason the estate planning meeting Derek had scheduled for the following month was not going to be a conversation about paperwork, but the first visible moment in a process that had been invisible for 7 years, and that was about to become very difficult to manage in the dark. If you have ever watched something built against you start to come apart because you were paying attention when they assumed you were not subscribed, because what happened when I walked into that family meeting with everything Carol and I had assembled is the part of this story where the architecture of 7 years of careful positioning met the architecture of 7 years of careful documentation. And only one of them was built on solid ground. The family meeting was on a Saturday afternoon in November 2017 at my parents' house in Concord, and I want to walk you through every hour of it because the hours are where the architecture revealed itself and where the gap between what my family believed was happening and what was actually happening became visible to me in a way that confirmed everything Carol and Howard and the Secretary of State's records had been building toward. I arrived at 1 in the afternoon, which was 30 minutes before the scheduled start, because arriving early to an environment you need to read before the conversation begins is a practice I developed in the Army and have never stopped using. And I parked on the street rather than the driveway, because parking on the street means you can see who else arrives and in what order and what they carry with them. And what I saw from my car in the 10 minutes before I walked to the door was Derek's truck already in the driveway, which meant he had arrived significantly earlier than the scheduled start, and a car I did not recognize parked at the curb 2 houses down that I noted without concluding anything about yet, and my mother's sedan in its usual spot indicating she had not gone anywhere that morning, and the specific stillness of a house in which people have been talking for a while before the guest they were talking about has arrived. My father met me at the door, and his handshake was the kind that communicates an agenda, firmer than casual, and held a beat longer than necessary. And he said, James, good, come in. We have been going over some things. And the we have been going over some things told me that the meeting had been in progress before I was included in it. which was consistent with Derek having arrived early and which confirmed that what I was walking into was not a family conversation, but a presentation. A structured offer that had been rehearsed before the audience arrived. The living room had a legal pad on the coffee table with handwriting I recognized as Derek's and a folder beside it that was thick enough to contain multiple documents and that had a rubber band around it in the way that people band folders when the contents are organized for sequential presentation rather than reference. And my mother was in the kitchen and called out, "James, do you want coffee?" And I said, "Yes, please, Mom." And I sat in the chair across from the couch where Derek was sitting, with the folder, and my father sat beside Derek, and the geometry of the seating told me everything I needed to know about the geometry of the meeting, which was that I was the audience and they were the presentation. My father opened by saying that he had been thinking about the future of the business and wanted to make sure everything was organized properly, which was the framing Derek had used on the phone and which was accurate as a description and incomplete as a characterization. And he said, "I have had an attorney put together some documents that I want to walk you through today." And I said, "Of course." And Derek opened the folder with the specific efficiency of someone who has been waiting to open it and pushed the first document across the coffee table toward me. And I picked it up and I read it the way Carol had told me to read it, completely and without reaction. And what it was a family succession agreement, a document that formalized the ownership transition of Callaway Property Services from Gerald Callaway to Derek Callaway upon Gerald's retirement or death. And that included a section titled Secondary Heir Acknowledgement, which was a clause asking me to sign a confirmation that I understood and accepted the succession arrangement and that I had no current or future claim to ownership or profit participation in the company. And the language of that clause was careful and specific in the way that language is careful and specific when an attorney has been asked to make something that is legally significant look like a routine administrative formality. And I read every word of it and set it back on the coffee table, and I said, "I will need to review this with my attorney before I sign anything." And Derek said, "It is pretty straightforward, James. It is just documenting what has always been the plan." And I said, "I understand that, and I will still need to review it with my attorney." And my father said, "Is there something specific you are concerned about?" And I said, "I am not concerned. I am thorough." And my father looked at Derek, and Derek looked at his legal pad. And the 3 seconds of that exchange contained more information than the previous 20 minutes of conversation had. I want to stop here because I know this story is reaching a wide room, and I want to know where you are right now. Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments and tell me where you are watching from, because I always mean it when I ask, and this is the part of the story where the room matters to me. What happened after I said I would review the document with my attorney is where the meeting changed register. And I want to be precise about the change because it was not dramatic and it was not confrontational on the surface, but underneath it had the specific texture of a conversation in which one party has just realized that the other party is not going to behave according to the script. And the realization is producing a recalibration in real time. Derek said, "I want to be honest with you about something." And when Derek started his sentence with, "I want to be honest with you," it meant he was about to say something he had prepared in advance and field tested for the reaction he wanted to produce. And he said, "Dad has been carrying a lot of the operational weight and his health is not what it was. And we need to get things in order sooner rather than later." And I said, "I understand." And he said, "The company has some debt on it right now from the expansion we did in 2015 and 2016. And if we do not get the succession structure formalized soon, the estate could end up in a complicated situation." And I said, "What kind of debt?" And he said, "Equipment loans, standard operational financing." And I said, "What were the loan amounts?" And he paused for a fraction of a second and said, "Around $350,000 total." And I said, "And the equipment is on the asset register?" And he said, "Of course." And I said, "And the consulting fees from 2015 and 2016, those are documented with vendor contracts. And the pause that followed that question was not a fraction of a second. It was long enough to be a different category of pause entirely. The kind that happens when a person has been asked a question they did not expect and is determining whether to answer it directly or redirect. And Derek said, "What consulting fees?" And I said, "The approximately $87,000 categorized as consulting fees in the 2015 and 2016 operating accounts." And my father said, "James, where are you getting these numbers?" And I said, "I've been doing my homework." And the room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the conversation has moved to a place that was not on the agenda. I did not show them anything that afternoon. I want to be clear about that because the temptation in a moment like that is to produce the folder, to lay the documents on the table and let the evidence speak in real time. But Carol had been explicit with me about the sequence, and the sequence was not this meeting. This meeting was information gathering. And what I was gathering in that living room was confirmation of the things I already knew, and exposure of the things I did not yet know, and what I learned in the 40 minutes after the consulting fees question is worth describing in detail, because it changed the shape of what came after. My father became very still in the way that people become still when they are deciding how much of something to acknowledge. And he said those payments were for legitimate services and they are documented. And I said I would be happy to see the documentation. And Derek said, "James, what is this about?" And I said, "I am trying to understand the full financial picture of a company that my father has built over 22 years and that I have been asked to sign documents about." And Derek said, "You have never shown any interest in this company." And I said, "I have shown interest in this company every time I sat at a dinner table where it was discussed and was not included in the conversation." And that sentence landed in the room with a weight that I had not calibrated in advance, but that felt accurate when it arrived. And my mother, who had come in from the kitchen with my coffee and had been standing in the doorway for some portion of the conversation, set the mug on the side table next to me and went back to the kitchen without saying anything. And I understood from the way she moved that she had heard more than she was showing. I left the meeting with the unsigned succession document, which I took with me at Carol's instruction so that she could review the specific language of the secondary heir acknowledgement clause. And I drove back to Church Street and called her from my car in the parking lot and described everything that had happened, and she listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she said, the pause after the consulting fees question, "How long was it?" And I described it, and she said, "And your father's?" Response, he said they were documented. He did not say where or with whom. And I said, "Correct." And she said, and Derek asked what this was about rather than producing the documentation immediately. And I said, "Correct." And she said, "James, I need you to listen to me carefully. What you described in that room today is consistent with people who know there is a problem in the documentation and are trying to determine how much you know before they decide what to disclose." And I said, that was my red. And she said, "I am going to call Howard tonight, and I am going to call my contact at the banking commission tomorrow morning. And I want you to do one thing before you go inside tonight." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Write down every word of that exchange while it is still verbatim in your memory." And I said, "I already have. I've been writing on my phone in my car since I left the driveway." And she said, "James, you are the most prepared client I have ever worked with." And I said, "I was trained to document everything and to trust the record over the memory." And she said, "Hold on to that, because what I need to show you tomorrow is going to require you to be very steady." And I said, "I am always steady." And she said, "I know." And she hung up, and I sat in the parking lot and finished writing. What Carol needed to show me was in her office the next morning, and it had arrived over the weekend from Howard Briggs via a contact he had in the commercial lending division of a regional bank, a contact who had reviewed the loan documentation for the 2 Callaway Property Services equipment loans at Howard's request, and who had found something in the application files that Howard had not been able to access through the public record alone. The loan applications had included financial projections prepared by Callaway Property Services, showing the company's anticipated growth from the equipment purchases, which was standard for commercial lending. And those projections had been prepared by a third party, and the third party was listed on the application as Piedmont Business Consulting, which was the name that also appeared on the consulting fee withdrawals from the operating account. And when Howard had looked for Piedmont Business Consulting in the North Carolina Business Registration Database, he had found that it was a single-member LLC registered in 2014, and that the registered agent for the LLC was a name that I want to tell you carefully, because the name is the structural center of everything that came after. The name was Thomas Allen Garrett. And Thomas Allen Garrett was the same bank officer who had processed both equipment loans at First Regional Bank of Cabarrus County, which meant that the bank officer who approved the loans had also received payment from the company he was lending to through an LLC he controlled for business consulting services that produced the financial projections that supported the loan applications he then approved. And when I read that on Carol's conference table on a Sunday morning in November 2017, I understood that what Carol and Howard had found was not just a family business dispute about a succession document and some consulting fees. The fourth thing Carol filed was a notification to the Veterans Benefits Administration that I had reason to believe my power of attorney had been used in a manner inconsistent with its authorized scope in connection with actions affecting my financial interests while I was on active duty. And this notification triggered a review process under the Service Member Civil Relief Act that added a federal dimension to the state court petition, and that produced a response from the VBA that arrived in Carol's office within 2 weeks, and that I am going to describe when I tell you about the hearing, because the response is part of what happened in that room. My father called me 3 days after the letters arrived, and his voice was the voice I had never heard from him before. Not the managed warmth of the Chamber of Commerce introductions, and not the dismissive efficiency of a good option for someone without clear direction, and not the agenda-forward firmness of the family meeting handshake, but something underneath all of those, something stripped of the performance layer entirely. And he said, "James, I need to talk to you." And I said, "You can talk to Carol." And he said, "This is between family." And I said, "Dad, the moment you used my signature to file a document that removed my legal standing in your company, it became something that a court handles, not a kitchen table." And he said, "I was trying to protect the business." And I said, "You were trying to protect Derek's inheritance using my legal authority that you were entrusted with while I was serving my country." And the silence that followed that sentence was the longest silence I had ever shared with my father, and it contained everything that had not been said at every Tuesday dinner and every Chamber of Commerce event and every 4-minute phone call from Walter Reed. And I let it sit there, and I did not fill it, because some silences need to be experienced completely rather than managed. And then I said, "Talk to Carol," and I ended the call. If you have ever been the person in a family who was handed the least and asked to sign away the rest, subscribe now, because what happened in the Cabarrus County Superior Court in March 2018 is the kind of reckoning that only becomes possible when you have been paying attention for long enough and with enough discipline to build something that a courtroom can actually use. The hearing was on a Thursday morning, and I wore my dress uniform because I had earned the right to wear it, and because I wanted everyone in that courtroom to understand the full context of the signature my father had used. The signature of a 19-year-old who was about to leave for basic training and trusted the man who asked for it. And Carol had not suggested the uniform, and I had not discussed it with her. I had simply decided that the complete picture included the person I had become in the years between the signing and the hearing, and that the uniform was part of that picture, and I was not going to omit it for the comfort of anyone in the room. My father and Derek were at the defendant's table with their attorney, a man named Robert Sykes, who had been handling Callaway family legal matters for 15 years, and who had, I later learned, reviewed the original power of attorney before the 2010 amendment was filed, and had noted the scope limitation language in a memo to my father that my father had not fully processed or had chosen not to fully process. And that memo was in Carol's possession because Howard's contact had found it in documents produced through the Banking Commission complaint. And its existence meant that the argument that the scope limitation had been an honest oversight was not available to my father's attorney, because the memo established that the scope limitation had been identified and noted before the amendment was filed, which changed the legal characterization from error to knowing. And knowing is the word that matters in a fraud analysis. The VBA response that Carol had received 2 weeks after the notification arrived was a formal finding that the use of the power of attorney to execute a business ownership transfer fell outside the instrument's authorized scope as defined by its own language, and that the VBA's review supported the petition to void the amendment. And this finding was entered into the court record before the hearing began, and it changed the posture of the proceeding because of federal agencies' formal finding in. Support of a petition is not the same as a private party's argument in support of a petition, and Robert Sykes knew it. And his body language, when Carol entered the finding into the record, was the body language of an attorney who has just watched a significant portion of his defensive position become unavailable. Carol presented the full case in 90 minutes. The power of attorney, the scope limitation, the memo from Sykes' own files establishing that the limitation had been identified before the filing, the Secretary of State amendment record bearing my signature, the forensic accounting summary, the Banking Commission complaint and its status, and the VBA finding. And she presented it in the order that built the picture from foundation to conclusion so that anyone in the courtroom, including the judge, experienced the architecture the way it had actually been constructed, layer by layer. And the final layer was the one that I had not told Carol about until the Sunday session when she asked me to show her what was in the folder. And the final layer was a letter. Not a legal document, not a financial record, a letter, handwritten, dated January 4th, 2010, from my father to me, 3 days before I left for basic training, in which he had written, "Son, I am proud of you for serving your country. The business will be here when you come home, and your place in it will always be waiting." And Carol read that letter into the court record last, after everything else. And the courtroom was very quiet when she finished reading it, and I looked at my father across the room, and he was looking at the table in front of him, and he did not look up. And I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think the honesty is more important than the narrative tidiness of a clean emotion, which is that I felt the grief of it more than I felt the vindication of it. The specific grief of having proof in a courtroom that a father had written words to a son that he had then spent 7 years acting against, and that the words had been sincere enough when they were written to produce a letter worth keeping, and insincere enough in practice to produce everything that followed. And that both of those things were true at the same time, and that the truth of both of them was more complicated than any single feeling could hold. The judge took the case under advisement and issued his ruling 14 days later, and the ruling voided the June 2010 amendment on the grounds Carol had argued, and ordered a forensic accounting of the company's finances from 2014 through 2017, and referred the Banking Commission complaint for expedited review, and directed that the Callaway Property Services ownership structure be restored to its pre-amendment state pending the outcome of the forensic accounting. And when Carol called me with the ruling, I was sitting in my apartment on Church Street, and I said, "What does restored to its pre-amendment state mean in practical terms?" And she said, "It was a financial arrangement involving a bank officer that had a name under federal banking regulations, and that name produced a different category of institutional involvement than anything I had anticipated when I put the folder together at Walter Reed." And Carol said, "I am filing a complaint with the North Carolina Banking Commission this week." And I said, "And the family meeting document?" And she said, "I am drafting a response to the succession agreement that will make clear that you are aware of the company's full financial history and that you are not in a position to sign a secondary heir acknowledgement at this time. And I said, and the document in my folder, and Carol looked at me the way she had looked at me every time I referenced it without describing it, with the specific patience of a woman who understood that I was going to tell her what it was when I was ready and not before. And she said, James, I think it is time for you to show me what is in that folder. And I looked at her and I thought about the airport and the laugh and the 12 people and the flag they almost gave my mother instead of me. And I said, yes, I think it is time. And I opened the folder and I put the document on the conference table between us, and Carol read it. And when she looked up, her expression was the one I had been waiting to see. The expression of a person who now understood the full architecture of what had been built against me and what had been built in response. And she said, James, with this document and everything else we have, what is about to happen to the people who filed that amendment in 2010 is going to be very difficult for them to manage. And I said, I know. And I said, good. I need to tell you what was in the document before I tell you what happened when Carol filed everything, because the document is the center of the architecture and everything built around it only makes full sense when you understand what it was. And I have been describing it obliquely for long enough that the description has served its purpose, which was to establish the surrounding structure before revealing the load-bearing element. And the load-bearing element is this. When I enlisted in the Army in January 2010, my father had asked me to sign a power of attorney document that he said was standard, something the family attorney had recommended, so that a responsible family member could make decisions on my behalf if I was deployed and unreachable, and something came up that required my signature. And I had signed it because I was 19 and I trusted him, and because the framing had been practical and parental and I had not yet developed the documentation. Instincts that 8 years of military service and 14 months at Walter Reed would eventually produce. What I had not known when I signed that power of attorney in January 2010 was that my father had used it 5 months later in June 2010 as part of the process of amending the company's ownership structure at the Secretary of State's office. And the specific way he had used it was to execute the secondary heir amendment on my behalf, meaning he had used my own legal authority to sign away my own structural claim to the company and the amendment that Carol had found in the Secretary of State's records bore my signature. Not my father's, not Derek's, mine, executed under the power of attorney I had signed at 19 before I left for basic training. And what that meant legally is what I need you to understand, because it is the difference between an unfavorable business decision and something with a specific legal name that produces specific legal consequences. And the name is fraud. And the consequences are not civil. They are criminal. And the document in my folder was the original power of attorney with the original scope limitation language that my father's attorney had drafted. And the scope limitation said the power of attorney was valid for financial and medical decisions only and specifically excluded business ownership transfers, which meant the amendment my father had filed using my signature was executed outside the authorized scope of the instrument he had used to execute it. And that is not a gray area in North Carolina law, and Carol had known that from the moment she saw the amendment and the power of attorney in the same session and understood the relationship between them, which is why her first call after our initial meeting had been to a colleague who specialized not in business law but in fraud, and why her second call had been to the Secretary of State's office, and why the document in my folder was the reason she had said that what was about to happen to the people who filed that amendment was going to be very difficult for them to manage. Carol filed 4 things simultaneously on a Monday morning in December 2017, and I want to describe each one because each one addressed a different dimension of what had been built against me, and together they formed a response that was proportional in the specific way that proportional responses are built, not to cause maximum damage, but to correct maximum distortion. And the difference between those two intentions is the difference between revenge and justice, and I have always been interested Injustice rather than revenge, because justice is durable and revenge is expensive in ways that exceed its returns. The first filing was a petition to the North Carolina Superior Court to void the June 2010 amendment to Callaway Property Services ownership structure on grounds that the amendment had been executed using a power of attorney instrument outside its authorized scope, which in plain language meant that the signature on the amendment was legally invalid, and that the ownership structure as it existed before the amendment should be restored. And this filing was supported by the original power of attorney document, the scope limitation language, the Secretary of State's amendment record, and a declaration from Carol's fraud specialist colleague establishing the legal basis for the invalidity claim. The second filing was a complaint to the North Carolina Banking Commission regarding Thomas Allen Garrett's role in the Callaway Property Services equipment loans, specifically the undisclosed financial relationship between Garrett and the company he was lending to through the Piedmont Business Consulting LLC. And this filing was supported by Howard Briggs' forensic accounting summary, the LLC registration records, the consulting fee withdrawal documentation, and the loan application files that Howard's contact had provided, and the Banking Commission complaint was the one that produced the fastest institutional response, because banking regulators have their own reasons for moving quickly when the documentation is clean, and the conflict of interest is documented, and the loan amounts are in the range that attracts federal attention alongside state attention. The third filing was a demand letter to Gerald Callaway and Derek Callaway requiring an accounting of all company funds from 2014 through 2017 within 30 days, specifically the consulting fee payments and the equipment loan proceeds, and requiring the preservation of all financial records pending the court's resolution of the ownership petition. And this letter was the one that my father and Derek received on a Tuesday morning, and that produced a phone call to my mother that she described to me the following Sunday in terms that told me the letter had landed with the weight Carol had intended it to carry. It means that as of the date of the original filing in 1989, the company had no formal succession designation, and the estate laws of North Carolina govern its distribution. And I said, which means, and she said, which means you have a legal claim to a portion of this company that no one can remove with a signature you did not authorize. And I said, and Thomas Allen Garrett. And she said, the Banking Commission has referred his case to the federal level. And I said, and Derek, and she said, Derek's attorney has been calling me since the ruling came down, and I expect a settlement conversation within the week. And I said, Carol, and she said, James, and I said, thank you, and she said, you did this, I just filed the paperwork, and I said, I know, and that was the truest thing either of us said in the entire conversation. The settlement conversation Carol had predicted came 7 days after the ruling, and I want to tell you about it with the precision it deserves, because the conversation is where the arithmetic of 7 years of deliberate exclusion was converted into the arithmetic of accountability, and the two numbers are not the same number, and the difference between them is what the judicial system produces when the documentation is complete and the argument is sound and the person who was wronged was paying attention when everyone assumed they were not. Robert Sykes called Carol on a Thursday morning, and the call lasted 11 minutes, and Carol called me immediately after and said they want to settle before the forensic accounting is completed. And I said, why before? And she said, because the forensic accounting is going to produce a number that is larger than what they are prepared to offer right now, and they want to resolve it before that number becomes the floor rather than the ceiling. And I said, what are they offering? And she told me. And I said, no. And she said, I thought you would say that. And I said, what does the forensic accounting look like at its current stage? And she said, Howard believes the full accounting, including the consulting fee irregularities and the equipment loan discrepancy, will establish a figure significantly larger than the initial offer. And I said, then we wait for Howard to finish. And she said, James, waiting extends a timeline, and the timeline has costs. And I said, I know what timelines cost. I spent 14 months at Walter Reed. I understand the cost of waiting for the right outcome rather than accepting the available one. And Carol said, "Then we wait," and we waited. Howard Briggs completed the forensic accounting in April 2018, and the number he produced was the number that made Robert Sykes call Carol again, this time with a different posture and a different offer. And the offer he made in April was substantially larger than the January offer, and it included a structured buyout of my restored ownership stake in Callaway Property Services, calculated at fair market value, rather than the net asset value that the equipment loans had artificially depressed. Which is a distinction that matters because net asset value minus debt produced a small number and fair market value based on the company's actual revenue and client base, and route contracts produced a significantly larger one. And Howard had established through the forensic accounting that the debt load itself had been inflated through the consulting fee arrangement with Piedmont Business Consulting, which meant the instrument that had been used to depress the company's apparent value was itself part of the documented financial irregularity, and the buyout offer that Robert Sykes made in April reflected the correction of that depression. And the number Carol read to me on the phone on a Wednesday afternoon in April 2018 was the number that quantified what a signature on a power of attorney was worth when the person who signed it had spent 8 years serving his country and 14 months in rehabilitation, and had come home and done the work in silence while being offered in administrative position processing paperwork. I said yes to the April offer because the number was fair and because fair was what I had been building toward, not maximum. Fair. And because the difference between fair and maximum is the difference between a person who wants what they are owed and a person who wants to cause damage. And I had never been interested in causing damage. I had been interested in correcting a record that had been falsified with my own signature while I was deployed. Thomas Allen Garrett's situation resolved through the federal banking regulatory process in a way that I was not a direct party to, but that Carol kept me informed about through public filings, and that I want to describe in the terms that are accurate without claiming credit for an outcome I did not engineer beyond the initial banking commission complaint. The Federal Review found that Garrett's undisclosed financial relationship with Callaway Property Services through the Piedmont Business Consulting LLC constituted a conflict of interest that violated federal banking regulations governing loan officer conduct. And Garrett surrendered his banking license in June 2018, and the matter was referred for criminal review. And First Regional Bank of Cabarrus County terminated his employment and conducted an internal audit of his loan portfolio that identified 2 additional lending relationships with similar structural characteristics, which meant that the Callaway Property Services situation was not an isolated incident, but a methodology that had been applied across multiple clients. And the correction of that methodology was not something I had set out to produce when I filed the Banking Commission complaint, but was a consequence of filing a complaint that was accurate and documented. And I think that is worth noting because it is an example of what happens when the right information reaches the right institution, which is that the institution does its job and the reach of the correction exceeds the scope of the original complaint in ways that the original complainant did not anticipate and cannot take full credit for, but can observe with the specific satisfaction of a person who introduced a true thing into a system designed to respond to true things. Derek and I reached a separate understanding through our attorneys in May 2018. And I want to be precise about what understanding means in this context, because it does not mean reconciliation, and it does not mean the erasure of what had been done. It means a formal acknowledgement of the legal resolution and a commitment by Derek to cooperate with the forensic accounting process and to make no further attempt to challenge my restored ownership claim. And in exchange, I did not pursue additional legal action against him individually for his role as a witness to the 2010 amendment, which Carol had told me was available to me, but which I had decided not to pursue because the pursuit of it would have required my mother to choose between her sons in a legal proceeding, and I was not willing to impose that cost on a woman who had called me every Sunday from Germany and from Walter Reed, and who had set a mug of coffee on the table beside me during the family meeting and gone back to the kitchen without saying anything, which was its own kind of testimony about what she had understood and what she had not been able to say. My mother and I have continued to talk on Sundays. The calls are different now from what they were at Walter Reed. More honest and less managed, the specific honesty of two people who have been through something difficult together and have come out the other side with fewer pretenses to maintain. And she said to me last year, "James, I am sorry I did not do more." And I said, "Mom, you showed up when it counted." And she said, "That is generous of you." And I said, "It is accurate." And we left it there because some things are better held in the space between accurate and generous than resolved into a single category. My father and I have not spoken since the ruling, not because I have made a formal decision about permanent estrangement, but because every time I have considered reaching out, I have thought about the letter he wrote on January 4th, 2010, and the amendment he filed on June 14th, 2010, and the 160 days between those two documents. And I have understood that what exists between us is not a misunderstanding that conversation can correct, but a fundamental question about character that only time and demonstrated change can address. And he has not demonstrated change in any way that has reached me. And so the door is where it is, which is not closed and not open, but positioned exactly where I have placed it, which is where it will stay until I decide otherwise. Callaway Property Services was sold in its entirety in 2019. My restored stake included to a regional property management company that had been one of its largest clients for 6 years, and that made an offer that reflected the company's actual market value, rather than the debt-depressed number the equipment loans had manufactured. And the proceeds of my stake after the buyout calculation were enough to fund the thing I had been building towards since the Sunday morning I had finished reading Howard's forensic summary and understood that the outcome was going to be real rather than theoretical. I enrolled in a Master of Business Administration program at UNC Charlotte in the fall of 2019, and I completed it in 2021, and I am currently operating a logistics consulting firm that I built from the same combination of military systems experience and business education and documentation discipline that I had been developing since 2010. And the firm is mine entirely. Every dollar of it earned, and every client of it developed, and every document of it filed in the right place at the right time. And I want you to understand that the satisfaction of that is not about the money. It is about the specific wholeness of a person who was told at 17 that the future of a family business was someone else's story, and who built a different story on the wreckage of that exclusion, and who sits here now telling it to you without bitterness. Not because the bitterness was never there, but because bitterness is weight, and I have carried enough weight, and I know the difference between what you put down and what you carry forward. I came home from Afghanistan with one leg and a folder and 17 years of being furniture in someone else's narrative, and I built something with all three of those things that no amendment at the Secretary of State's office can touch. And if you have ever been the person at the table who was not included in the conversation about the table, I want you to leave me a comment and tell me, how long did it take you to understand that the table was never the point? And what did you build instead? Because I think the answer to that question is the most interesting thing in the room.